year is 1220. It is the height of the Crusades. Muslims and Christians have been fighting one another in a war that has lasted for over 120 years. Tens of thousands of Christian soldiers are trapped and dying on a flooded field in Egypt. The opposing Muslim army blocks their only escape. St. Francis of Assisi and the Sultan of Egypt, Mohammed al-Kamil, have defied the angry times and human nature itself to cross the bloody battle lines and meet each other. But will it make a difference? How does anyone stop a seemingly endless conflict? The Sultan and the Saint was made possible by the generous support of these institutions and individuals, because peace requires wisdom. Beset by revolts and numerous assassination attempts, the beleaguered ruler of the Eastern Christian Empire of Byzantium makes a reluctant appeal. He asks the rival pope of the Catholic Church in Rome for mercenaries. He wants an outside army in his pay, palace guards he can trust, and soldiers to fight off Muslim invaders on his borders. The pope seizes the opportunity to assert Rome's power and perhaps reunite the two churches under it. He doesn't send the emperor the mercenaries he wants. Instead, he sends his own army to fight the Muslims. If it succeeds, Rome will dominate the region. The Eastern Church will never rival it again. The Pope calls for a crusade to recapture Jerusalem after 5 centuries of Muslim rule. Most people who answer the Pope's call are not killers. Many are peasants who've never fought before.
We know that from some developmental psychology that children have this tendency towards empathy towards others, that they have a tendency to behave altruistically towards others, that they have kind of the underpinnings of morality and justice, and all of these things help a society remain together. If you have all of these psychological tendencies that are preventing you from harming others, how do you motivate people to fight against other humans? One of the most common ways is through dehumanization.
Your brethren who live in the East are in urgent need of your help. Carry aid promptly to those Christians and destroy that vile race from the lands of our friends. Those who refuse to pay him the servant's service that they owe him will justly deserve to suffer a sentence of damnation.
What you unleash then is a certain religious fervor. We are going to take our holy sites from these non-believers. Of course, non-believers are thrown into one category, which would include Jews.
The Crusades' first victims are not Muslims. They are the Jews of Europe.
There's nothing special about the teachings of religion that's driving conflict. Evidence is starting to show that the psychological tendencies that drive conflict are the complex combination of processes in the brain. They're a bunch of kind of deep structures that are underneath, that are kind of central in the brain. Oftentimes it's referred to as the reptilian brain. And we know that it responds really strongly to fear conditioning, fear learning.
The religious propaganda focused on demonize the other as heretical, as satanic. And when you see that you have in your midst the other as well, you say, why not start killing here?
Contemporaries were very puzzled as to why some of the Crusaders attacked the Jewish communities. The excuse was that the whole race was guilty of the death of Christ, and therefore they were fair game.
This kind of moral disengagement from harming others through dehumanization seems to be a major route through which you can get one group of humans to actually harm and kill another group of humans.
Those who would follow Christ to the crown, let them also follow him to battle! Yeah!
You have a situation where you have a lot of fear activated, so the subcortical structures are kind of going off the hook. It's very strong. It has a powerful effect on our behaviors and can flip immediately.
So as the Crusaders make their way across Europe, they're not distinguishing between the Muslims who have captured the holy sites in Palestine and the Jews who lived amongst them in Europe. So all, quote-unquote, non-believers, including schismatic Christians, are the targets. When the Crusaders come into Jerusalem, Christians are killed along with Jews and Muslims. No one is distinguished from the other.
As far as they were concerned, they were all wearing strange clothes, people of a strange culture, so they must all be our enemies.
The cries of battle fade. Silence descends on the conquered city. But it is not the end of violence. It is only the beginning. Christians and Muslims battle back and forth over Jerusalem for almost 90 years. In 1187, troops commanded by the famous Muslim leader Saladin retake the city. Jerusalem is no longer under Christian control. In the glow of this victory, Saladin's young nephew prepares to be a leader himself one day. His name is Muhammad al-Kamil. More than Jerusalem will be at stake when he becomes Sultan. The very future of Islam will be in his hands. Even as a child, al-Kamil stands out.
He loved philosophy, mathematics, learning, and of course studying his own faith.
Typically, a traditional Islamic education would begin with memorization of the Quran. And the Quran, as Muslims believe it, is the eternal, uncreated word of God.
A childhood filled with so many expectations can be lonely. Al-Kamil's mother eases the demands.
The Quran speaks to religious communities other than the community of Muhammad. The Quran speaks to Jews and Christians who are children of Abraham, who share the faith in the one God.
No compulsion. No compulsion is to be on them.
We have significant theological and practical differences, but we harness those differences to compete with one another, not in animosity, but towards the common good of all.
He grew up with a great love of learning. It was certainly part of the royal court for him to be trained to be the leader of Egypt.
Al-Kamil comes to power at a time of crisis in Egypt. Poor harvests have brought famine. Political dissent challenges his rule. Religious tensions are on the rise.
Enough. Enough.
But a greater danger looms across the sea. Cries for the recapture of Jerusalem once again sweep through Europe. In the markets and streets and taverns, a romanticized view of war takes hold. Many dream about the glories of battle and are eager for the coming conflict. One of them is a young man named Francis from a small Italian town called Assisi.
As a young man, Francis is what we might call a bon vivant, a man around town. His social activities are hanging out with his friends, probably going around Assisi, you know, making a little bit of trouble.
Drinks for everyone! Although he was a member of the middle class, and his father being the merchant, Francis also had pretensions of the class above him, the aristocracy, the nobility. He liked to dress in fine clothing. He liked the panoply of being a knight, the armor, the weaponry. He was like a knight wannabe.
Petty wars between Italian city-states were common. When one erupts between Assisi and a neighboring city, Francis eagerly joins.
And suddenly he's thrust into battle. And of course, battle at this time is horrible. This is hand-to-hand combat. This isn't anything abstract.
Since Francis is from a wealthy family, he's taken prisoner and held for ransom.
He languished until his father could ransom him from captivity, but it took a year.
Francis leaves that imprisonment after a year as a shattered and hollowed out young man.
Was he simply going to return to his life of carousing and just having fun?
How are you? What are you doing? What are you...
What was his life to be about? What was he being called to?
In Cairo, a dispute between Muslims and Christians threatens bloodshed.
Sultan al-Kamil has very good relations with Christians. On one occasion, there was a dispute about whether a mosque or a church should be built on a certain site.
The mob in Egypt wanted to build a mosque next to the most holy Christian church in Cairo.
It must go. A mosque once stood here. It must be rebuilt. Yeah! No mosque was ever here.
He determined that there had been a church there earlier, which was the claim the Christians were making, and so he supported them in that.
You are looking for excuses to justify a wrong.
It must be rebuilt. No.
No! It must be rebuilt! It must go! No. No.
When the mobs were throwing stones at him, he didn't react violently. He didn't ask his bodyguards to go and kill them.
God created us separate nations so that we could learn from one another and become better in what we are. Not harm one another. Become less.
This became very controversial. He was willing to take some heat for this. The Christians really appreciated that they were being treated fairly.
Francis spends a number of months, perhaps even a year, wandering in the countryside. One day he comes to the profound insight of his life, which will be the foundation for the rest of his life and his spirituality and of his own order.
Leprosy was a common and much feared disease in the Middle Ages.
Francis had an abhorrence of lepers.
they would have to make some kind of noise with a bell or a clapper when someone was approaching.
He realizes, perhaps the first time in his life, these are genuinely suffering human beings, men and women, like himself. This then becomes the foundational insight. Every man and woman, without exception in creation, is a brother and a sister, one to another, constituting a commonality that we all share with each other.
That basic conviction that really took hold in Francis's heart set him on a path that was very different than his original dream.
Francis adopts this life of voluntary poverty and penance and preaching a message of peace. Gradually, there's other young men in his town who see the wisdom of this and are attracted to it because they also want to drop out of the cycle of violence that is afflicting them.
Where there is darkness going on, where light, where's everyone go? Where there is sadness, joy. We are more than just our daily struggle. The Lord has made us all for a greater purpose. To be instruments of peace. Where there is doubt, faith, it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. It is in dying that we are born to eternal life.
There was a tremendous response to living in the world in this way. And little by little, a number of people followed Francis.
Francis travels the country, preaching about the Lord of love. But the medieval church still holds to the vision of a ferocious, vengeful God who summons believers to war. A new pope, Pope Innocent III, calls for another crusade.
Every day, during the celebration of Mass, when the time has come, before the kiss of peace, the priests should say to their flocks, God, we humbly beseech thee, to snatch this land from our enemy!
Crusaders go to Constantinople on promises to fund their new war over the Holy Land. When the payments don't come, they attack Byzantium instead.
Once you've stoked this in-group fervor, it seems like that can be applied to many different outgroups.
They make a prostitute sit on the emperor's throne.
They tried to sell this whole idea to the Pope by saying, oh, now we hold Constantinople, we've also restored it to the true Holy Catholic faith.
Those fools!
The Pope wasn't really buying this, but he had to make the best of a bad job.
Pope Innocent III explicitly banned attacks on Christian communities. But with Constantinople in ruins, he decides to assert Rome's authority. He dispatches a trusted cardinal named Pelagius to take control.
Cardinal Pelagius was sent as the Pope's legate, and he was sent to solidify the gains of the Latin Christian Church, the Roman Church, against the Greek clergy who wanted to return to their own city.
He wears these scarlet robes, which was something new at the time, because that's the color of the martyrs that he's adopted.
What has happened here is a travesty.
Don't speak until given permission.
Such behavior.
Tell him to tell his priests that they are subject to the one true Pope, His Holiness in Rome.
What right
Tell
do you have?
him that the only words I want to hear from him are the names of those priests who ignore this. That is all.
He was known to be a hard-nosed, intransigent supporter of the papal policy. In other words, it was the supremacy of the Latin Church over any competitors, be they the Greek Church, be they Islam.
No one speaks unless Pelagius first gives permission. Understand? Go.
After the sacking of Constantinople, Pope Innocent III vows that the next crusade will be under strict papal control. He sends an order to the priests throughout Europe to recruit a new army. One of the most successful preachers was a German priest named Oliver of Paderborn.
He was a cleric. He was involved in preaching the crusade, a very intelligent man, very pious man,